The hologram floated in the center of the great hall, and every name on it glowed in different colors based on rank. And at the very bottom, in a dull red that seemed almost apologetic, sat the name Kira Vasquez. She stood there looking up at it, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw tight. And she counted the names above hers one more time, just to make sure she had not made a mistake. 1,247 students in the first-year class of the Galactic Combat Academy, and she was ranked dead last around her. The other students moved through the hall in groups, their alien bodies casting strange shadows under the blue lights. And none of them looked at her, and none of them spoke to her. And she had grown used to that in the 6 weeks since she had arrived. A Vethkai student walked past her, its crystalline body humming with stored energy, and it stood nearly 3 meters tall. And its exoskeleton could stop a plasma round without cracking. And Kira had seen it shatter a training dummy with a single punch during combat practice. Behind the Vethkai came a group of Draconari, massive four-armed warriors with scales like armor and muscles that rippled under skin the color of dried blood. And they were laughing about something in their rumbling language. And one of them glanced at Kira and made a gesture she did not understand but knew was not friendly. She turned away from the rankings and walked toward the exit. The Galactic Combat Academy sat on Station Meridian, a massive structure that orbited a dying star at the edge of Concord space. And it had trained warriors for over 10,000 years. And its graduates had become legends and generals and heroes across 100 worlds, and now it had accepted its first human student. Kira knew why they had let her in. And it had nothing to do with her scores on the entrance examination, or her 3 years of training on Earth, or the letters of recommendation from the United Nations. Defense Council Earth had just joined the Concord, the great alliance of 12 spacefaring species. And the Concord needed to show that humans were welcome. And what better way to do that than to let one little human girl into their most famous academy? It was politics, and everyone knew it. And Kira knew it better than anyone. Her quarters were small, barely larger than a closet, and the bed was hard. And the walls were bare metal, and she had not bothered to decorate because she did not plan to stay here any longer than she had to. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out a photograph from under her pillow. And it showed an old woman with gray hair and dark eyes, and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. Her grandmother, Rosa Vasquez, who had died 2 years ago, who had survived the Jakarta collapse when the city fell into the sea, who had walked 18 kilometers on 2 broken legs to pull survivors from the wreckage. Kira could still hear her voice, rough and warm and stubborn as stone. Mia, humans were never built to be the strongest, and we were never the fastest, and we do not have claws or fangs or armor. But we were built to be too stubborn to stay down. And that is worth more than all the strength in the universe. Kira put the photograph away and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The next morning, combat training began at 600 hours, and Kira was there before anyone else, stretching in the corner of the massive training arena while the lights slowly brightened overhead. Instructor Valfus arrived exactly on time, his 4 Draconari arms clasped behind his back, and his face was covered in scars from battles Kira could not imagine. And his 4 eyes swept across the students as they filed in. "Today we work on close combat," he announced, his voice deep enough to rattle Kira's chest. "And you will be paired randomly, and you will fight until one of you cannot continue. And there will be no complaints and no excuses." The holographic board shuffled names, and Kira watched it spin, and her stomach tightened when she saw her pairing Torkin, the highest-ranked student in the class, a Draconari who stood over 2 meters tall and weighed more than 3 adult humans. Combined scattered laughter rippled through the arena, and someone made a clicking sound that Kira had learned was the Vethkai version of mockery. And she ignored it all as she walked to the fighting circle. Torkhaven looked down at her, and his 4 eyes blinked slowly, and something like pity crossed his face. "I will try not to break you." "Small one," he said. Kira did not respond, and she just raised her fists and shifted her weight to the balls of her feet. The bell rang. Her cavern moved fast for his size, his upper right arm swinging in a wide arc that would have taken her head off if it had connected. But Kira was already moving, ducking under the blow and rolling to his left side. She came up and drove her elbow into the soft spot behind his knee, and he grunted in surprise, and his leg buckled for just a moment. And that moment was all she needed. She kicked the back of his other knee and sent him stumbling forward. And then she was on his back, her arm wrapped around his thick neck. Squeezing with everything she had, it was not an otter. Kvan reached back with 2 of his arms and grabbed her like she weighed nothing. And he threw her across the circle, and she hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. She lay there for a moment, gasping, her ribs screaming with pain, and she heard more laughter from the watching students. But she did not stay down. She pushed herself to her feet, and her vision was blurry, and her whole body ached. But she raised her fists again, and she saw something flicker in Torkvan's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or confusion, or something else she could not name. He beat her, of course, and in the end she could not stand anymore. And she lay on the ground with blood on her lips and bruises blooming across her skin. But she had lasted 4 minutes against the best fighter in the class, and that was 3 minutes longer than anyone had expected. And when Instructor Valthus dismissed them, he looked at Kira with an expression she had never seen before that night, alone in her quarters. Kira smiled through her split lips. She was still at the bottom of the rankings, and she was still the weakest student in the academy, and everyone still thought she was a joke, but she had made them wonder, even if just for a moment, and that was a start. 6 weeks passed, and Kira learned to survive in a place that was never meant for her. She woke before dawn every day and trained alone in the empty arena. And she studied the fighting styles of every species in the academy. And she memorized their weaknesses and their blind spots and the places where their armor was thin. She lost more fights than she won, and her body became a map of bruises and scars. And the medical droids knew her name better than any other student. But she never quit, and she never complained, and slowly, very slowly, the other students began to notice, not with respect, not yet, but with something like confusion, because they could not understand why she kept getting up, why she kept fighting, why she refused to accept what everyone knew was true. Humans were weak, and humans were fragile, and humans did not belong here on the day of the relic examination. Kira walked into the Hall of Echoes with the rest of her class, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt something other than determination. She felt awe. The Hall of Echoes was enormous, a cathedral of black stone and silver light, and along its walls stood artifacts from civilizations that had risen and fallen before the Concord. Was even a dream. There were weapons that sang with energy, and armor that seemed to breathe, and machines whose purpose had been lost to time. And Kira walked past them all with her eyes wide, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. But it was the artifact at the center of the hall that drew everyone's attention. The hammer of Varak, set on a pedestal of obsidian, and it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Kira had ever seen. Its head was forged from collapsed star matter, darker than darkness itself, and its surface was covered in equations and symbols that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them. And even from 20 meters away, she could feel its presence like a pressure in her chest. Headmaster Siren floated at the front of the hall, an ancient Nephilim whose body was barely visible beneath the psychic glow that surrounded them, and when they spoke, their voice pressed directly into every mind present. The relic examination is one of our oldest traditions, and today you will each approach the hammer of Varak and attempt to lift it. and your interaction with the artifact will be recorded and analyzed for your psychological evaluation. A Draconari student near Kira raised one of his hands and asked, "Has anyone ever lifted it, Headmaster?" Siren's telepathic voice carried something that might have been sadness. The Varachni created this weapon 12,000 years ago as the ultimate test of worth. And the hammer generates a localized gravity field that responds to the wielder's inner state. And it grows heavier when it senses doubt or fear or weakness. And only one with absolute conviction can lift it. The headmaster paused. In 12,000 years, no one has succeeded. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. And Kira stared at the hammer, and she felt something stir in her chest. Something she could not name. The examination began, and students approached the hammer one by one in order of their ranking, which meant Kira would be last. She watched as Torkvan stepped up first, his forearms flexing, his confidence radiating from him like heat. And he gripped the hammer's handle and pulled. His muscles bulged and his veins glowed with bioluminescent blood, and his feet dug into the stone floor. And for a moment, it seemed like the hammer might move. Then the gravity field intensified, and Torkvan's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground with a crack that echoed through the hall. And 2 medical droids rushed forward to help him away. Student after student tried, and student after student failed. A Vethkai named Crystalis channeled all her stored energy into a single point and gripped the hammer. And it trembled for just a moment before slamming down so hard it cracked the pedestal and Nephilim. Student wrapped the hammer in telekinetic force and tried to lift it with his mind. And the effort made his nose bleed and his eyes roll back. And he collapsed unconscious before the hammer moved even a centimeter. The hours passed. And Kira watched, and she studied each attempt. And she noticed something strange. The strongest students, the ones who were most confident, seemed to fail the fastest, as if the hammer could sense their pride and used it against them, and the students who approached with doubt, who already believed they would fail. Those students could barely touch the handle before the gravity crushed them to their knees. When her name was finally called, Kira walked forward through a hall that had grown quiet with boredom. No one expected anything from the human, and most of the students were talking among themselves. And even Headmaster Siren seemed distracted. Kira stopped in front of the pedestal and looked at the hammer up close. It was even more overwhelming, and she could feel its gravity field probing her, testing her, reading something deep inside her that she did not fully understand. She thought about her ranking at the bottom of the list, and she thought about every fight she had lost, and she thought about the laughter and the mockery and the looks of pity. She was afraid, and she knew it, and she did not try to hide it, but fear had never stopped her before her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. And she remembered the stories of human history, the wars and the plagues and the disasters. And she remembered how her species had survived them all, not because they were strong, but because they refused to die. She reached out and wrapped her fingers around the handle. The weight hit her immediately, a pressure so intense she felt like her bones would shatter. And her knees shook, and her vision went dark at the edges. And somewhere far away she heard gasps of shock from the watching students, but she did not let go. The hammer pressed down on her, and it whispered in a voice that was not sound but something deeper. You are small, and you are weak, and you do not belong here. And Kira answered, not with words, but with something truer. I know. The weight increased, and her arms screamed with pain, and she felt tears streaming down her face. And still she held on. I know I am afraid, and I know I am weak, and I know that everyone expects me to fail. The hammer pressed harder, but that has never stopped me, and it never will. Because that is what you do not understand about humans. She thought of her grandmother walking on broken legs, and she thought of her father holding a failing pressure seal with his bare hands. And she thought of every human who had ever faced the impossible and simply refused to accept it. We do not need to be without fear, and we do not need to be without doubt. Her arm began to rise. "We just need to keep moving anyway." The hammer came with it. The Hall of Echoes went completely silent. Kira stood with the hammer of Varrock raised above her head, her arms trembling, her face wet with tears and sweat, and around her, 1,246 students stared with expressions she had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not mockery, not dismissal. Fear. The ancient equations carved into the hammer's surface began to glow, softly at first and then brighter. And Kira watched through blurred vision as the symbols shifted and changed and rewrote themselves into patterns that had not existed moments before. The hammer was adapting to her, learning from her, becoming something new. She held it for 3 more seconds, feeling its weight like the pressure of a dying star. And then she lowered it gently back to the cracked pedestal and stepped away. Her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees. And she knelt there on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking with exhaustion. No one moved. Headmaster Siren floated forward, their psychic glow flickering with emotions Kira could not read. And they stopped directly in front of her and looked down with eyes that held 12,000 years of history. "In all my centuries at this academy," Siren said, and their telepathic voice trembled, "I have seen many students attempt to lift the hammer of Varrock, and I have seen warriors and heroes and legends fail where you have succeeded." The headmaster paused, "But I have never seen the hammer change itself, and I do not know what that means. And I do not think anyone does." Kira looked up at them, still breathing hard, and she managed to speak. "I think it means your definitions of strength have been too narrow." A ripple went through the crowd, and Kira heard whispers in a dozen languages. And she saw students looking at her with new eyes. And she saw Torkvan standing at the edge of the hall with an expression she could not understand. She pushed herself to her feet, and her legs were weak, and her arms felt like they were made of water. But she stood straight and met the stares of everyone around her. "My name is Kira Vesquez," she said, and her voice was quiet but steady. "And I am the first human admitted to the Galactic Combat Academy, and I was ranked last in my class. And I just did something that none of you could do." She paused and looked around the hall. "I think I would like a re-evaluation." The silence stretched for another long moment. And then Instructor Velthus stepped forward from the crowd of faculty members, his scarred face unreadable, his forearms crossed over his massive chest. "The rankings will be updated," he said. And there was something in his voice that might have been respect. Kira nodded and walked toward the exit. And the crowd poured before her like water. And she kept her head high even though every step sent pain shooting through her exhausted body. She made it back to her quarters before she collapsed. She lay on the floor for a long time, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she could not organize. And eventually, she pulled herself onto the bed and fell into a deep and dreamless sleep when she woke. The station was in chaos. Her personal terminal was flashing with hundreds of notifications, and when she opened it, she saw that the footage of her lifting the hammer had spread across the entire Concord in less than 12 hours. News feeds from a dozen worlds showed the clip on repeat. Analysts and experts discussing what it meant. Politicians and military leaders making statements. And Kira watched it all with growing unease. The Draconari War Council had demanded an official investigation, claiming that the human must have cheated somehow, that she must have used some unknown technology, or tricked the Nephilim. Consensus had attempted to psychically probe the recording for tampering and found nothing. The Vethkai Collective had issued a formal statement of cautious interest in humanity's potential as an ally, and Earth, her home, had erupted in celebration with parades in the streets and her face on every screen. And the United Nations had declared a planetary holiday in her honor. Kira closed the terminal and sat in the darkness of her quarters and felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on her. Someone knocked on her door. She opened. It to find Instructor Vala standing in the corridor, his massive frame filling the doorway, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "May I come in?" he asked. And it was not really a question. She stepped aside, and he entered. And he stood in the center of her tiny room and seemed to fill every corner of it. "I have been a warrior for 80 years, he said, "and I have trained thousands of students. And I have seen things that would break most minds. And I thought I understood what strength meant." He paused and looked at her with his 4 scarred eyes. "The hammer has chosen warriors before, in the ancient times, before the Varachni fell. And it chose the mightiest and the bravest and the most powerful beings in the galaxy." He shook his head slowly, but it never rewrote itself for them. And it never changed its fundamental nature to accept them. "And I do not know what that means about you or about your species." Kira met his gaze and did not look away. "Maybe it means that strength is not just about power," she said. "And maybe it means that the universe has room for more than one kind of warrior." Velta stared at her for a long moment. And then he did something she had never seen him do. He smiled. "Perhaps you are right, human, and perhaps there is more to learn from your kind than we thought." He turned to leave, and then stopped at the door. "Be careful in the coming days, Kira Vasquez, because the galaxy is watching you now. And not everyone who watches does so with friendly eyes." He left, and Kira stood alone in her quarters. And she felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She walked to her window and looked out at the stars. Countless points of light scattered across the infinite darkness. And she thought about what Velthus had said: not everyone who watches does so with friendly eyes. Somewhere out there, in the black spaces between the stars, something was stirring. Something old and hungry and terrible, and it had felt the hammer wake for the first time in 12,000 years, and it remembered. The Hollow remembered what the hammer had been built to fight. And they remembered the Varachni who had nearly stopped them. And they remembered that they had won in the end. They had consumed the Varachni and 100 civilizations after them. And they had grown fat on despair and fear. And they had slept in the darkness for millennia, but now the hammer had found a new wielder. And that wielder came from a species they had never encountered. A species that burned with something they could not understand. The Hollow began to move, and in her tiny quarters on Station Meridian, Kira Vasquez looked at the stars and felt something watching her from the void. She did not know what was coming, but she knew she would face it anyway, because that was what humans did, and that was what she had always done. And that was what she would continue to do until her last breath. She was afraid. She had always been afraid. It had never stopped her yet. The months that followed changed everything. Kira's ranking in the academy jumped from last place to somewhere in the middle. Not because she had suddenly become stronger or faster, but because the instructors did not know how else to classify someone who had done the impossible. She continued to train, and she continued to lose fights against students who were physically superior to her. And she continued to get up every time she was knocked down. And slowly, the other students began to approach her, not as friends. Not exactly, but as something else. A Crystallis. The Vethkai, who had cracked the pedestal trying to lift the hammer, found Kira in the training arena one morning and stood beside her in silence for a long time. "I have been thinking about what you did," she said finally, her crystalline body humming with a soft light. "And I have been trying to understand how a species so fragile can produce someone like you." Kira continued her stretches and did not look up. "We are not fragile," she said. "We are just different, and different is not the same as weak." Crystallis made a sound that might have been agreement. And after that, she began training with Kira in the mornings. And they did not speak much, but something had shifted between them. Turkvan was harder to read. The Drakenari champion had not spoken to Kira since the day of the relic examination. And when they passed in the corridors, He looked at her with an expression that mixed confusion and wounded pride, and something that might have been curiosity. One day, during a combat exercise, they were paired together again. And Kira expected the same brutal fight as before. Instead, Torkvan stood across from her in the fighting circle and lowered his forearms. "I do not want to fight you today," he said. And his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Kira raised an eyebrow and asked, "Why not?" "Because I have been thinking," he said, "and I have realized that I do not understand what happened in the Hall of Echoes. I do not understand how you did what you did, and it bothers me more than losing ever could." He paused and looked at her with all four eyes. "Teach me." Kira stared at him for a long moment, and then she smiled. "I cannot teach you to be human," she said, "but I can teach you what I have learned about fighting when you are weaker than your opponent." And so a strange friendship began, and Kira found herself training with the highest-ranked student in the academy. And she taught him about leverage and timing, and the places where his confidence made him blind in return. He taught her about strength and power, and how to take a hit without breaking. And they pushed each other in ways neither had expected. The galaxy continued to watch delegations arrive from every corner of Concord space. Politicians and generals and scientists who wanted to study Kira and understand how a human had succeeded where so many others had failed. The Concord Military Council offered her a position in their elite forces upon graduation, with a rank that no first-year student had ever been offered. The Nephilim Consensus invited her to their homeworld for research purposes. That made her deeply uncomfortable, and from Earth, messages arrived every day, from family and strangers alike. All of them proud, all of them hopeful, all of them looking to her as a symbol of what humanity could become. Kira ignored most of them and focused on her training, because she knew that symbols were fragile things. And she did not want to be a symbol, she wanted to be a warrior then. In the third month after the relic examination, everything changed. Kira was in her quarters when the alarms began, a sound she had never heard before. Deep and resonant and filled with something that felt like terror. She ran to the main hall of the academy and found chaos students and faculty were everywhere, all of them looking at the massive holographic display that dominated the center of the room. And on that display was something that made no sense. Ships, if they could be called ships, emerging from holes in reality itself. Vessels that seemed to exist between dimensions, their forms shifting and impossible, and behind them, a darkness that was not empty, but hungry. Headmaster Siren's telepathic voice cut through the panic. "The Hollow have returned." The words meant nothing to Kira, but she saw the effect they had on everyone around her. And she saw terror in eyes that had never shown fear before. And she saw ancient warriors who had faced death 1,000 times suddenly go pale. "What are the Hollow?" she asked. And her voice was steady, even though her heart was racing. Instructor Valulis answered, and his voice was hollow. "The enemy that destroyed the Varachni, the species that created the hammer, the darkness that has consumed 100 civilizations, and they have slept for 12,000 years." He looked at her with something like despair. "They have awakened because they felt the hammer wake, and they have come to finish what they started." The display showed the Hollow ships engaging the Concord's defense fleet. And it was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Concord ships fired weapons that should have destroyed anything in the galaxy, and the Hollow ships simply absorbed the energy. And then they reached out with tendrils of darkness that wrapped around the defending vessels and drained them of everything. Not just power, not just life, but something deeper. Hope. Kira watched as the crew of a Draconari battleship fell into despair, so deep they turned their weapons on themselves. And she watched as a Nephilim cruiser went silent as its telepathic crew was overwhelmed by psychic anguish. And she understood the Hollow did not just kill, they fed on fear and despair and hopelessness, and they used those emotions as weapons. And they had grown strong on the suffering of countless civilizations. "Evacuate the station," Headmaster Siren commanded. "All students to the escape pods, all faculty to defensive positions. We must buy time for the young to escape." Students began running, and Kira saw Chrysalis heading for the escape bay. And she saw Torquevin hesitating near the entrance to the Hall of Echoes. She did not run, she walked against the flow of panicking students. Toward the Hall of Echoes, toward the hammer that sat on its cracked pedestal. And she felt its presence calling to her like a heartbeat in the darkness when she reached it. The hall was empty except for Torquevin, who stood near the door with his forearms clenched at his sides. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Kira walked to the pedestal and looked at the hammer. "What I have to do?" She reached out and wrapped her fingers around the handle. And this time, the weight was different, familiar, almost welcoming. And she lifted it easily and felt its power flow through her. The hammer showed her things, visions of the past, memories of the Varachni who had created it and fought with it and died with it. She saw them face the hollow 12,000 years ago. Brave warriors who had nearly won, and she saw why they had failed. They had fought alone, each convinced that only individual strength mattered. And the hollow had picked them off one by one, feeding on their isolation, growing stronger with each death. "You fought alone," Kira whispered. "And that is why you lost." The hammer pulsed with something that might have been agreement. She turned to Torquevin, and she held out her hand. "I cannot do this alone," she said. "And I do not want to, because that is not how humans fight." He stared at her, and she saw the fear in his eyes, and she saw him struggling against 12,000 years of Draconari pride. Then he took her hand. "Tell me what to do," he said. Kira smiled. "Help me gather the others." They found them in the escape bay, a handful of students and faculty who had not yet fled. And Kira stood before them with the hammer resting on her shoulder and spoke words she had never planned to say. "The hollow feed on despair, and they feed on isolation, and they feed on the belief that you are alone and that fighting is hopeless." She looked at the faces around her, at Chrysalis, whose crystalline body flickered with uncertain light, at Instructor Valus, whose scars seemed deeper in the emergency lighting, at a dozen others who had stayed behind for reasons they could not explain. But we are not alone. And fighting is never hopeless, because hope is not about believing you will win. She raised the hammer, and its ancient surface glowed with equations that had rewritten themselves for her. Hope is about fighting anyway. Torquevin stepped forward and stood beside her, his forearms flexed and ready, his fear visible but controlled. "I have been the highest-ranked student in this academy for 3 years," he said. "And I thought that meant I was the strongest. And I was wrong." He looked at Kira with all 4 eyes. "She is the strongest. Not because of her body, but because of what is inside her. And I will follow her into this fight, one by one." The others stepped forward. Chrysalis joined them, her body humming with gathered energy, and she said, "The Vethkai do not run from battles we can win." Instructor Valthus moved to stand at Kira's other side, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I have been a warrior for 80 years, and I have never seen anything like what is happening today. And I will not let a student face this alone. More joined, students and teachers. Species that have been rivals for centuries standing together." And Kira felt something building in her chest. Something warm and fierce and impossible to name. They moved through the station as the hollow's assault intensified, and the walls shook with impacts, and the lights flickered and died, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. But they did not stop. They reached the central hub of the station, where the main defense systems were controlled. And they found the hollow waiting for them. The creatures were nightmares given form. Shapes that existed between dimensions, bodies that shifted and changed and defied understanding. And their presence filled the air with despair so thick it was hard to breathe. Kira felt it pressing against her mind, whispering that she was small and weak and that nothing she did would matter. She had heard those whispers Whole life she ignored them. "Stay together," she shouted. "And do not let them isolate you, because alone we fall, but together we stand." The battle began. It was chaos and terror and violence beyond anything Kira had ever experienced. And the Hollow came at them from every direction. Their tendrils of darkness reaching for minds and hearts and souls. A young Nephilim student screamed as despair wrapped around him. And Kira was there in an instant, the hammer blazing with light as it cut through the darkness and freed him. "You are not alone," she told him. "And you are not going to die here." Torquevin fought like a hurricane, his forearms moving in perfect coordination. And every time a Hollow tried to feed on his fear, Crystallis was there to blast it with stored energy. Instructor Veilthus protected the younger students, his scarred body absorbing blows that would have killed anyone else. And he fought with the fury of someone who had found something worth dying for. Hollow pressed harder, and more of them came, an endless tide of darkness and despair. And Kira felt her strength beginning to fade. She had been fighting for what felt like hours, and her body was broken. 3 ribs cracked, and her left arm shattered, and blood streaming from wounds she could not count. But she did not stop. She thought of her grandmother, walking on broken legs. And she thought of her father holding a failing seal with his bare hands. And she thought of every human who had ever faced the impossible. "We do not quit," she whispered. And the hammer heard her and responded. It showed her what she needed to do. The Hollow were connected, all of them linked to a central consciousness, the heart of darkness that fed on the despair of countless civilizations. And if she could strike that heart, she could end them all. But she could not do it alone. She reached out, not with her hands but with something deeper, and she felt the others around her, their fear and their courage and their determination. "Give me your strength," she called out. "Not your bodies, not your power, but your will. Your refusal to give up. Your stubborn hope that tomorrow can be better than today." And the answered Crystallis channeled her energy into Kira, and it felt like sunlight on a frozen world. Torquevin opened his warrior's heart and let his pride become something new, something shared. Instructor Valthus gave her 80 years of battles and the wisdom that came from surviving them all. And the others, students and faculty, species that had never fought together, gave her their hope and their fear and their determination. The hammer blazed with light brighter than a star, and Kira felt power flowing through her. Not just her own power, but the combined will of everyone who stood with her. She raised the hammer above her head, and she looked at the heart of the hollow darkness. And she smiled. "This is what humanity brings to the galaxy," she said. And her voice echoed through dimensions. Not strength, not speed, not power. She brought the hammer down, connection. The blow struck the heart of the hollow, and it carried with it the combined conviction of a dozen species, the stubborn hope of 100 hearts, the refusal to surrender that defined humanity and now defined them all. The hollow screamed, a sound that existed beyond sound, and their darkness shattered like glass. And their dimension ships collapsed into nothing, and for the first time in cosmic memory, the ancient enemy fled. They fled from a small human woman with broken bones and blood on her face. And they fled from the allies who stood with her. And they fled from something they could not consume, hope that was shared connection, that could not be broken, stubbornness that would not die. The battle was over. Kira stood in the ruins of the station's central hub, the hammer resting on her shoulder, her body finally giving out. And she fell to her knees as the others gathered around her. Torquevin caught her before she hit the ground, his forearms gentle in a way she had never expected. "You did it," he said. And there was wonder in his voice. Kira laughed, and it hurt. And she did not care. "We did it," she corrected him. "And that is the point. And that is what I have been trying to tell you all along." Headmaster Siren appeared, their telepathic voice soft with something that might have been awe. "The rankings will be updated. Ms. Vasquez." Kira looked up at the ancient Nephilim, and grinned through her split lip. "Keep me at the bottom," she said, "because I kind of like the view from there, and besides, rankings do not matter." And they never did. She looked around at the faces of those who had fought beside her. That species who had been strangers, and were now something more. What matters is who stands with you when the darkness comes. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her. And as she drifted into unconsciousness, she heard the hammer humming with satisfaction. 12,000 years ago, the Varachni had created it to find the ultimate warrior. Someone with absolute conviction, who could face the hollow alone, but they had been wrong. The ultimate warrior was not someone who fought alone. The ultimate warrior was someone who reminded others that they did not have to. Kira Vasquez, ranked last in her class, the weakest student in the academy, the fragile human who did not belong. She had changed everything, and somewhere, in the void between stars, the hollow trembled, because they knew she would come for them again. And next time she would not be alone. She would bring the whole galaxy with hers. That was what humanity did. That was what Kira did. And it was only the beginning.